Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive. And today we're going to be exploring this idea of meritocracy.
Oh, yeah.
The whole idea that if you work hard enough, you could achieve anything.
Right.
Well, we're going to see if it's really that simple.
Okay.
We've got a really interesting mix of stuff to dig into for this one.
Hmm.
We've got academic papers. We've got some political commentary.
Interesting.
Even a little bit of dystopian fiction.
Oh, dystopian fiction. Always a fun way to see where an idea might lead if taken to its extreme.
Exactly.
Gary.
It can really expose those hidden cracks in a seemingly perfect system.
Yeah.
So we'll be looking at how this idea of meritocracy took root in British history,
Okay.
how it became so intertwined with education, and whether it really delivered on its promise of a fairer society.
You know, one of the key things to remember is that on the surface, meritocracy sounds pretty appealing, right?
Yeah.
It seems like the ultimate fair system. You get rewarded based on your effort and talent.
Right, like that classic American dream ideal. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps and you can achieve anything.
Exactly. But what's fascinating is that this concept really took hold in post-war Britain.
Hmm.
You know, the country was rebuilding and there was this real desire to create a more just and equitable society.
So was education seen as the key to making that happen?
Absolutely. Think about the big changes happening in education around that time. The Education Act of 1944,
Yeah.
the expansion of grammar schools. It was all about identifying and nurturing the brightest students, regardless of their background.
So both socialists and conservatives were on board with this idea,
Yes.
although maybe for different reasons.
That's right. Socialists saw it as a way to break down those old-class barriers that prevented people from succeeding based on their talent,
Okay.
while conservatives liked the focus on individual responsibility.
It seems like everyone was excited about this new meritocratic system,
Yeah.
but wasn't there a bit of a warning sign back then?
Yeah.
A book that kind of threw a wrench in the whole thing?
That's right. In 1958, a sociologist named Michael Young publishes this book called The Rise of the Meritocracy. And get this, he actually coined the term meritocracy.
Oh, wow.
But the book was a dystopian satire warning about all the potential downsides of a merit-based society.
Whoa. So he basically invented the word just to tear it apart. Talk about irony.
Exactly. Young was super critical of the idea. He foresaw a society where intelligence, measured mostly through IQ tests, became the ultimate measure of a person's worth.
Okay.
Which, as you can imagine, is incredibly problematic.
Because she was basically saying, hold on, maybe intelligence is a lot more complicated than just a test score.
Yes. And he argued that fixating on IQ ignores all those other valuable qualities that people possess. Empathy, creativity, practical skills, things that are actually super important for a society to function well.
I'm already starting to see how this whole meritocracy thing could go wrong.
Right.
Is that when things started to shift in terms of how people view the concept?
Well, there's a really interesting evolution of the term itself, particularly in the 1970s. Meritocracy went from being a term of criticism, thanks to Young's warnings, to a more positive ideal.
So how did that happen? Did people just forget about all those potential problems?
It's more complex than that. You see, meritocracy started to be associated with ideas like social mobility and equality of opportunity. It became this buzzword that politicians across the political spectrum could get behind.
So instead of questioning the system, people were aspiring to this ideal of a meritocratic society. But did that really address the underlying problems that Young had identified?
That's the million-dollar question. This shift in language reflects a deeper internalization of meritocratic principles.
Okay.
People began to truly believe that success was entirely within their control.
So they bought into that pull yourself up by your bootstraps mentality, even though there were still all these systemic inequalities at play.
Exactly. And that's a problem because it places all the blame for failure on individuals without acknowledging the very real barriers that exist in society.
Okay, so we're starting to see the cracks in this seemingly perfect system. Right. But if we're talking about meritocracy, we have to talk about competition, right?
Yeah.
It's often seen as a driving force behind innovation and efficiency.
Yes, but even competition has a more complex role in meritocratic societies than you might think.
Right.
Initially, Young viewed competition as a necessary evil, something to be minimized for a truly efficient system.
Interesting.
But what he saw happening was that competition became a core value in later interpretations of meritocracy.
So instead of finding ways to cooperate and work together, people were encouraged to see each other as rivals.
Exactly. And Young argued that this relentless drive for individual achievement could actually harm social cohesion.
It's like we're all playing a zero-sum game where one person's success means another person's failure.
And that can be incredibly damaging to a society.
Yeah.
While healthy competition can be motivating, too much emphasis on individual achievement can create a culture of blame and resentment.
You know, it's interesting how Young also factored families into his critique of meritocracy. Initially, he saw them as obstacles because they passed down privilege through inheritance.
Right.
But then he kind of flipped the script, didn't he?
He did. Young warned that families could also become tools for reproducing the meritocratic elite. Children of the elite would have access to better education, more resources,
Wow.
all these advantages that would help them stay at the top.
It's like a self-perpetuating cycle where the winners of the meritocratic game pass down their winning strategies to the next generation.
Yeah.
And doesn't that tie into the whole rise of populism that we're seeing today?
It absolutely does. Populism often feeds on resentment towards elites who are seen as out of touch and self-serving,
Okay.
benefiting from a system that's rigged in their favor.
Which is exactly what Young predicted, right?
Yes.
He warned that those who felt excluded and looked down upon by the meritocratic elite would be susceptible to populist movements.
Precisely. And we're seeing that play out in today's world.
Okay, so we've uncovered some pretty serious potential downsides to meritocracy. But where do we go from here? If a purely meritocratic society is so problematic,
Yeah.
what are the alternatives? Are there other systems that could actually ensure fairness and opportunity for everyone?
There are a number of alternative ideas that have been proposed, and one that's been getting a lot of attention lately is universal basic income, or UBI.
Oh yeah, I've heard about UBI.
Yeah.
It's that idea where everyone, regardless of their income or work status, gets a guaranteed basic income, right?
That's right. The idea is that it would provide a safety net, ensuring that everyone has their basic needs met, regardless of their merit in the system.
So it's like a way to address those unequal starting points that we were talking about earlier. It's like saying, look, everyone deserves a basic level of security and dignity, regardless of their position in the meritocratic hierarchy.
Exactly. And there's actually some real-world evidence to suggest that it could work.
Oh, really?
Finland ran a UBI trial a few years ago and found that it improved people's well-being and even motivated them to work or study.
That's really interesting. It challenges that traditional assumption that people won't be motivated to work if they have a safety net.
It really does. And it shows that there are other ways to create a society where people can thrive, even if it's not based solely on individual merit.
So it's not just about individual policies like UBI.
Right.
It's about finding new ways to structure our organizations and distribute power.
Yeah, absolutely. And one idea that's gaining traction is the concept of cooperative governance structures.
So instead of those traditional top-down hierarchies, we're talking about more democratic and egalitarian ways of running things.
Exactly. Cooperative models emphasize shared ownership and decision-making processes. They aim to create a more equitable distribution of profits and resources.
It sounds like it directly addresses that concentration of power at the top that Young was so worried about.
It does. Cooperative structures are all about empowering everyone within the organization, recognizing that everyone has valuable contributions to make, regardless of their position in the hierarchy.
It's a completely different way of thinking about work and leadership.
Right.
It's almost like a shift from a culture of competition to a culture of collaboration.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
Cooperative models are built on the idea that everyone benefits when everyone has a voice and a stake in the success of the organization.
So it's not just about tearing down the existing meritocratic system.
Right.
It's about building something entirely new, something that values different forms of intelligence and different ways of contributing.
That's exactly right. And that's where we're going to pick up in the next part of our deep dive.
Stay with us. There's so much more to explore. So before we jumped into alternatives, we were talking about cooperative governance.
Right.
And how those structures could be a potential solution.
Yeah.
But we didn't really have time to unpack how that works in practice.
That's right. We just scratched the surface.
Yeah.
Co-ops come in many flavors. You've got worker co-ops where the employees own and manage the business.
Okay.
Consumer co-ops like REI where the customers are the owners. And even producer co-ops where independent producers band together to market and sell their goods, like some agricultural co-ops you might see.
Wait, so are you saying those farm stands I see popping up could actually be part of a movement towards dismantling meritocracy?
Well, it depends.
Yeah.
Not every co-op is created equal, but the underlying principles are interesting to consider in this context.
Okay.
Shared ownership, democratic decision-making, focusing on the needs of the members over maximizing profit for a small group of shareholders.
Yeah.
Those ideas challenge the traditional power structures that Young was warning us about.
It's almost like a completely different economic model altogether.
Yeah.
One that's less focused on competition and more on cooperation.
Exactly. It's about recognizing the interdependence of everyone involved.
Okay, so that's one way to think about alternative systems.
Right.
But we've also touched on some of the specific criticisms of meritocracy that Young and others have raised.
Yeah.
For example, the whole issue of using intelligence tests, like IQ tests, to determine someone's potential.
Right.
It just seems so reductive to boil a person's worth down to a single number.
It is.
Yeah.
And it raises important questions about what we even mean by intelligence.
Right.
Young argued that focusing too much on IQ scores ignores all those other qualities that are essential for a thriving society, like creativity, emotional intelligence, and practical skills.
It seems like we've created a system that rewards a very narrow definition of intelligence.
Yeah.
Often reflecting the biases of those who are already in power.
Right. It can end up reinforcing existing inequalities. If the people at the top decide what merit looks like, then the system is likely to benefit them disproportionately.
And I imagine this ties into the whole issue of social cohesion, which Young also talked about.
Yes.
If everyone's constantly competing against each other,
Right.
doesn't that undermine our sense of community?
Absolutely. Young warned that this relentless drive for individual achievement could erode those bonds of community and solidarity that are so essential for a healthy society.
Yeah.
Instead of working together for the common good, we end up viewing each other as rivals.
I've definitely seen that play out in my own life.
Right.
It can feel like everyone's so focused on getting ahead
Yeah.
that they forget about the people around them.
It's a real concern. And it creates this dangerous illusion that those who fail simply didn't try hard enough, ignoring all the systemic factors that contribute to success or failure.
Right, it's that pull yourself up by your bootstraps mentality again.
Exactly.
But it ignores the fact that some people are starting the race with a significant head start,
Yeah.
while others are facing hurdles from the very beginning.
And this brings us to the crucial link between meritocracy and the rise of populism, which we talked about earlier.
Right, how populism often thrives on the resentment of those who feel excluded from the system.
Exactly. Populist leaders often tap into the anger and frustration of those who feel that the meritocratic system has failed them. They point to the elites, the winners of the meritocratic game, as the source of all their problems.
It's kind of a scapegoat,
Right.
a way to simplify complex problems by blaming a specific group of people.
That's one way to think about it. And that message can be incredibly appealing to those who feel powerless and voiceless,
Okay.
who feel like the system is rigged against them.
Which is precisely what Young warned about.
Right.
He predicted that the lower classes, feeling excluded and looked down upon, would be fertile ground for populist movement.
Exactly. And we're seeing that play out in real-world politics today.
Okay, so it seems like this idea of meritocracy, while it may have started with good intentions, has some serious unintended consequences.
Right.
But I'm still wrestling with this question of alternatives.
Yeah.
If a purely meritocratic society is so problematic, what other options do we have?
It's a tough question, and there's no easy answer.
Yeah.
But one thing that's becoming clear is that we need to move beyond this narrow focus on individual merit and think more holistically about what a just and equitable society actually looks like.
So it's not about rejecting hard work or achievement.
Yeah.
It's about recognizing that those things don't exist in a vacuum.
That's right. We need to acknowledge the role that systemic factors play in shaping people's opportunities and outcomes. And we need to create systems that provide a genuine level playing field, not just the illusion of one.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So what are some concrete steps we could take in that direction? I know we've already talked about UBI, but what other policies or structural changes could we consider?
Well, beyond UBI, there's been growing interest in exploring alternative economic models, like those cooperative structures we discussed earlier,
Right.
shifting away from shareholder-driven capitalism towards models that prioritize worker well-being and community benefit.
So thinking more about the common good than just individual profit.
Exactly. And within existing structures,
Okay.
we can also look at things like progressive taxation, robust social safety nets, and investing in early childhood education to mitigate those unequal starting points we talked about.
Right. So it's not just about tearing down the existing system,
Yeah,
but about building up something new that's more equitable and sustainable.
absolutely. And this might involve challenging some deeply held beliefs about individual responsibility and the role of government. It's
Yeah.
not an easy task, but it's essential if we want to create a society that truly works for everyone.
It's a big undertaking.
Yeah.
And it requires a fundamental shift in perspective,
Right.
moving away from this idea of a zero-sum game where one person's success comes at the expense of another,
Mm.
and instead focusing on creating a system where everyone has the opportunity to thrive.
That's a great way to put it. It's about shifting from a mindset of scarcity to a mindset of abundance,
Right.
recognizing that we can all benefit when everyone has the chance to reach their full potential.
It's a powerful vision,
Yeah.
and it definitely makes you think differently about what's possible. Right. But I'm curious, are there any historical examples where we've seen this kind of shift play out successfully, where a society has moved away from a more individualistic meritocratic model towards something more collaborative and equitable?
That's an interesting question.
Yeah.
And it takes us back to the historical context of meritocracy that we discussed earlier.
Okay.
Remember how we talked about how the concept emerged in post-war Britain as a way to create a more just and egalitarian society?
Yes, and for a while it seemed like it was actually working.
Yeah.
There was a significant increase in social mobility during that period.
That's right. But over time, as we discussed, the system started to revert back to its old patterns,
Okay.
with those who had already benefited from the system using their advantages to maintain their position at the top.
So it's like those initial gains in equality were eventually eroded by the same forces that had created the inequalities in the first place.
Precisely. And this highlights a crucial point.
Okay.
Even if we can create a system that's perfectly fair on paper, those deeply ingrained social and economic structures have a way of reasserting themselves.
So it's not enough to just change the rules of the game.
Right.
We have to change the entire game itself.
That's what it seems like.
Yeah.
And that requires a much deeper transformation of our values, our institutions, and our ways of relating to each other.
It's a tall order for sure.
It is.
But I think exploring these alternative models like UBI and cooperative governance
Yeah.
gives us some concrete places to start.
Right.
And it challenges us to think beyond the limitations of the existing system.
Exactly. It's about opening up to new possibilities, recognizing that there might be other ways of organizing ourselves that better serve the needs of everyone.
And that's where we'll pick up in the next part of our deep dive.
Okay.
We'll explore some more of those possibilities and discuss how we might start to put them into practice.
Stay tuned. There's much more to come.
We've spent this deep dive really picking apart this whole idea of meritocracy, haven't we?
We have. Yeah, we've looked at its historical roots, the ways it's evolved, and some of the potential pitfalls. And honestly, it's left me wondering, is there a way to salvage this idea? Or do we need to completely rethink how we approach fairness and opportunity in society?
That's the big question, isn't it? I mean, on the surface, the idea of rewarding effort and talent seems fair.
Right.
But we've seen how easily that can morph into a system that reinforces existing inequalities.
Right. And I think one of the biggest challenges is moving away from this hyper-individualistic mindset that's so deeply embedded in our culture.
Okay.
This belief that success is solely a product of individual effort.
Right.
And that anyone who fails simply didn't try hard enough.
That pull yourself up by your bootstraps mentality that we keep coming back to.
Exactly. And that ignores the reality that we're all interconnected, that our individual successes and failures are influenced by a whole web of social, economic, and political factors.
So if we want to create a truly just and equitable society, we need to acknowledge those interconnected systems and find ways to create a more level playing field.
Absolutely. It's not just about individual effort.
Right.
It's about creating a system where everyone has a fair shot at success, regardless of their background or circumstances.
That sounds great in theory, but how do we actually make that happen? Are we talking about radical systemic changes? Or are there smaller steps we can take to start moving in the right direction?
It's probably a combination of both.
Yeah.
We need to think big picture about the kind of society we want to create,
Okay.
but also focus on practical, actionable steps we can take right now.
Okay, so give me an example.
Sure.
What's something concrete we could do to address those unequal starting points that we talked so much about?
Well, we've already discussed universal basic income as one potential solution.
Right.
Providing everyone with a basic level of financial security could go a long way toward leveling the playing field. But beyond that, we could also look at investing more heavily in early childhood education.
So making sure that all children have access to quality education from a young age.
Exactly. That's one of the most effective ways to break the cycle of poverty and create a more equitable society. Because when children have a strong foundation, they're more likely to succeed in school, get good jobs, and contribute to their communities.
I can see how that makes sense.
Yeah.
But what about those deeply ingrained cultural beliefs we were talking about? How do we shift away from that individualistic mindset and foster a greater sense of community and collective responsibility?
That's a tough one. It requires a change in our values and priorities as a society.
Yeah.
But I think we can start by promoting narratives that celebrate collaboration, empathy, and social responsibility.
So highlighting stories of people working together to solve problems,
Exactly.
supporting each other and building stronger communities.
Exactly. And we can also encourage more community involvement, volunteering, and civic engagement. These are all ways to strengthen those bonds of community and remind people that we're all in this together.
You know, it's interesting to think about how our education system could play a role in this as well.
Yeah.
What if we focus less on rote memorization and standardized tests and more on developing critical thinking skills, fostering creativity and encouraging collaboration?
I love that idea. We need to equip young people with the tools they need to navigate a complex and rapidly changing world,
Yeah.
not just prepare them to compete in a narrow and outdated system.
Right. It's about nurturing the whole person,
Yeah.
not just churning out workers or test takers.
Yes.
It's about creating citizens who are engaged, compassionate, and ready to contribute to a better future.
I couldn't agree more. And that's why these conversations are so important, because challenging these deeply ingrained assumptions about meritocracy, individualism, and success is the first step toward building a more just and equitable society for everyone.
It's been a really thought-provoking deep dive,
It has.
and I think you've given us a lot to consider.
Yeah.
I especially appreciate those concrete examples of things we can actually do to start making a difference.
It's been a pleasure exploring these ideas with you, and I hope our listeners feel inspired to keep digging deeper and exploring these issues in their own lives.
Me too. Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive. Till next time.